Illinois congressional district who is known to give contributions to members of both parties and have great influence over political contributions in congressional politics in that part of Illinois. Right. So when Mr. Porter got this phone call, he took that to be an implicit threat that his campaign contributions could dry up if he weren't to vote in a way that would be desirable by the administration.
All right. Carl, thanks very much. Let's take a quick look inside the committee room where the debate over this first article of impeachment is continuing, but a number of members have left the room. As you can see from that sort of high shot there, presumably they have left the room so they'd be in a position to hear what the president has to say in now about 1 minute from now. Down at the White House, the aides have come out. They've given the signal to the waiting television and other journalists in the Rose Garden that it will be 5 minutes. Expected to be a 5-minute statement that the president will read in just a moment. We can see now the door to the Oval Office located along the colonnade at the White House, from which we expect the president to appear any minute now. And let's go back now to our, there you see the Christmas wreath hanging along the door along the colonnade to the Oval Office complex just inside. Let's go back to Jim Angle and let him set the scene further for us at the White House. Jim?
Brett, the door has opened and closed to the Oval Office. Pardon me, excuse me, someone is walking away with my mic cord here. The door has opened and closed to the Oval Office here a couple of times. We've seen the president in there looking down at his desk, apparently looking over his notes at the last minute. We know that he met with his advisors up until about 9:30 last night, talking about the prospect of making a speech today. The president said that he would sleep on it. They got up today. They have been talking about it all day. This is obviously his last chance to do this before he leaves for the Middle East and, of course, in time to get on the evening news. Britt?
Yes, I rather suspect that the calculus about the evening news is something that any sensible presidential advisor and indeed any sensible president would obviously have in mind. You're trying to maximize the impact of what you say in what is very much a political situation. You're trying to speak to people who are out in their far-flung congressional districts across the country. No better vehicle available than broadcast news, and it is now some 10 past 4 Eastern Standard Time, not so very far away from the moment when those broadcasts will come on the air. And indeed, it appears the president is emerging now. Here he is.
Good afternoon. As anyone close to me knows, for months I have been grappling with how best to reconcile myself to the American people, to acknowledge my own wrongdoing, and still to maintain my focus on the work of the presidency. Others are presenting my defense on the facts, the law, and the Constitution. Nothing I can say now can add to that. What I want the American people to know, what I want the Congress to know, is that I am profoundly sorry for all I have done wrong in words and deeds. I never should have misled the country, the Congress, my friends, or my family. Quite simply, I gave in to my shame. I have been condemned by my accusers with harsh words. And while it's hard to hear yourself called deceitful and manipulative, I remember Ben Franklin's admonition that our critics are our friends, for they do show us our faults. Mere words cannot fully express the profound remorse I feel for what our country is going through and for what members of both parties in Congress are now forced to deal with. These past months have been a torturous process of coming to terms with what I did. I understand that accountability demands consequences, and I'm prepared to accept them. Painful though the condemnation of the Congress would be, it would pale in comparison to the consequences of the pain I have caused my family. There is no greater agony. Like anyone who honestly faces the shame of wrongful conduct, I would give anything to go back and undo what I did. But one of the painful truths I have to live with is the reality that that is simply not possible. An old and dear friend of mine recently sent me the wisdom of a poet who wrote, "The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it." So nothing, not piety, nor tears, nor wit, nor torment, can alter what I have done. I must make my peace with that. I must also be at peace with the fact that the public consequences of my actions are in the hands of the American people and their representatives in the Congress. Should they determine that my errors of word and deed require their rebuke and censure, I am ready to accept that. Meanwhile, I will continue to do all I can to reclaim the trust of the American people and to serve them well. We must all return to the work, the vital work of strengthening our nation for the new century. Our country has wonderful opportunities and daunting challenges ahead. I intend to seize those opportunities and meet those challenges with all the energy and ability and strength God has given me. That is simply all I can do, the work of the American people. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, can a reasonable person conclude that you lied under oath, sir? Do you agree with your attorney's assessment of that?
Mr. President, if it goes before the Senate, goes to trial, would you be willing to resign to save the country from this process?
And so the door to the Oval Office closes again as Chris Ensko, the young presidential aide who works at the president's side, reaches out and closes the door. The president spoke for about 4 minutes flat, spoke of his having misled the country. He spoke of the depth of his remorse, the depth of his sorrow at what he had done. My colleague Tony Snow, who took a leave from the field of journalism for a brief period of time and was a presidential speechwriter for President Bush for a time, is here with me. Tony, how do you assess this as a piece of rhetoric intended to show people that the president feels this and that it's causing him pain?
Well, it's an interesting speech in that it's probably a kinder, gentler version of the remarks he gave on January 21st. The formula then was to deny and say, it's my job to lead the American people into a new century. This time he says, well, I misled, or he talked later about errors of word and deed, but it's time to get back to the business of the American people.
Well, he did spend most of his time talking about his sorrow and the torture and the pain and his preparation to accept consequences.
This is probably as poetic as Bill Clinton has ever gotten in a public statement. It's interesting because as a president, his moments of greatest eloquence have almost always been off the cuff. And yet in this case, we had citations from Ben Franklin. We had paraphrases of the Bible. We had a number of things, including a thing where he said, nothing, not piety, nor tears, nor wit, nor torment can undo what has happened. What the president was trying to say to the American people is, I messed up. Now there's going to be a lot of quibbling over how much he confessed to, but that's what he said. I can't undo it. He said that nothing Congress or anybody else does me will be worse than the torment I visited upon my family. No more specific than that, not my wife, my daughter, but my family. And finally what he said, there was an interesting passage where he said, if it comes to rebuke and censure, I am willing to accept that. Right. Which is one of those carefully worded phrases where you're using legal terms of art, rebuke and censure being two of the options available to Congress as it takes a look at what happens in the context of reviewing the president's misdeeds. Let's
go down to Jim Angle, who's still there in the Rose Garden, and I know, Jim, you're not going to be there that long. They'll come and chase you out, and I definitely wanted to get your reflections on these remarks. Contrast them, if you can, with what had been planned for him, at least at one stage, and what was expected here.
Well, the president said about as much as he could say, as much as he was willing to say, without admitting perjury. I mean, he did say that he was profoundly sorry for what I have done wrong in words and deeds. That is not a terribly direct way of saying that he lied under oath, but it is about as close as I think you're going to get from the president, about as close as his lawyers will let him go without putting him in further legal jeopardy.
Well, he said misled, too, didn't he, at one point? He used the term misled. He used the word misled.
Yep. Yeah. He also, interestingly, referred to accounts of him on Capitol Hill, obviously by Republicans, saying he is deceitful and manipulative, and using a quotation from Ben Franklin saying our critics are friends because they show us our weaknesses, suggested that he accepted that judgment as harsh as he thought it was. He seemed to be acknowledging what people on Capitol Hill are suggesting without acknowledging that he did anything that is legally wrong. That is something the White House thought he had to do, signaling that he will accept whatever rebuke and censure is handed him by the Congress as a way of saying, yes, I believe I am wrong. I believe I must accept the consequences. I know that you will force me to undergo some sort of punishment in order to salve the nation's conscience about truth-telling, and I am ready to do that. This was something the White House, at least many advisors, had thought the president had to do to get this process moving forward. You know, the president had made some statements that were somewhat contrite, especially at a prayer breakfast some time ago. But in the interim, Britt, as you know, the White House and the president's lawyers had criticized everyone in the process, the Republicans in the committee, Chairman Hyde, Newt Gingrich, especially Ken Starr, and suggested that the president's problems were as much the fault of those men as they were of the president himself.
Well, yeah, there was none of that here, was there?
There was none of that here. That was a sense on Capitol Hill that had to be reversed for them to try to have some sort of influence over this process and keep it from going to a vote for impeachment, articles of impeachment, in the full House.
Keep it from going to a vote or keep it from passing? It looks like it's going for a vote.
Yes,
yeah, right.
Yes.
All right, stand by there, Jim, as long as you can. Let me turn to Carl Cameron up on Capitol Hill. Carl, you have, to the greatest extent possible, your finger on the pulse, at least of those Republicans who are here in town. Was this just what the doctor ordered? Not nearly enough? What?
Well, the first thing is it was very deferential to Congress. In his past remarks, the president has talked about the American people and his friends and family, and occasionally omitted sometimes references to Congress specifically, and that has irked some of the critics here on Capitol Hill. And today, at virtually every opportunity, he was, it seemed, almost deliberately saying, mentioning Congress, and that degree of deference will play well amongst Republicans particularly. The absence of a direct recognition of the constitutional crisis and the potential impeachment here might create some sense of unease amongst Republicans. His mentioning of a willingness to accept rebuke or censure is certainly the administration's desire, but I think Republicans would like to see the president recognize just how serious this is by a recognition of the potential for impeachment. And as I said before the president's remarks, a number of them have said they would like to hear him asked to be censured and not impeached. The chairman, it seems, has returned. They are beginning to, in fact, they are voting now. This may indeed, Britt, be the vote on the article.
I think it may be well, isn't there was an amendment pending, Carl. I apologize to the audience because we've kind of lost track of events as we followed what the president was saying. I think this may be a vote on the amendment offered by Mr. Rogan, which he called a technical amendment, which was attacked by the Democrats as further vagueness. But let's listen in and see if we can sort it out. Apologies to the audience.
Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Nadler? No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Watt?
No.
Mr. Watt votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Ms. Waters?
No.
Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Meehan?
No.
Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Delahunt? Mr. Delahunt votes no. Mr. Wexler?
No.
Mr. Wexler votes no. Mr. Rothman?
No.
Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Barrett? No. Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Hyde?
Aye. Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hyde votes aye.
the gentleman from North Carolina. How about recorded?
Mr. Coble is not recorded, Mr.
I
Chairman.
vote aye.
Mr. Coble votes aye.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Graham.
Mr. Graham votes aye.
The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hutchinson.
Aye. Mr. Hutchinson votes aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Bono.
Aye.
Ms. Bono votes aye. Mr. Chairman, there are 21 ayes and 16 noes.
And the amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on Article 1. The question occurs on Article 1. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. And we will certainly have a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Sensenbrenner. Aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. McCollum.
Aye.
This
McCollum
is
votes
Article
aye.
1
Mr.
as
Deacon.
amended slightly to add the language to the accounts, the words one or more of the following, which that's a rough paraphrase of what it is, so that any of the enumerated acts that are included in the article would be encompassed in the charge that the president committed perjury before a grand jury. It is expected that this, like the amendment, will pass on a party line vote. But this is the article, the first article, the first about perjury.
Aye. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Barr.
Aye.
Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Jenkins.
Aye.
Mr. Jenkins votes aye. Mr. Hutchison.
Aye.
Mr. Hutchison votes aye. Mr. Pease. Mr. Pease votes aye. Mr. Cannon.
Aye.
Mr. Cannon votes aye. Mr. Rogan.
Aye.
Mr. Rogan votes aye. Mr. Graham. Ms. Bono.
Aye.
Ms. Bono votes aye. Mr. Conyers.
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Frank. Mr. Frank votes no. Mr. Schumer.
No.
Mr. Schumer votes no. Mr. Berman.
No.
Mr. Berman votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Watt.
No.
Mr. Watt votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Meehan.
No.
Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Delahunt.
No.
Mr. Delahunt votes no. Mr. Wexler. Mr. Wexler votes no. Mr. Rothman.
No.
Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Barrett.
No.
Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Hyde.
Aye.
Mr. Hyde votes aye.
Mr. Graham.
Aye.
Mr. Graham votes aye.
Have all voted who wish? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 21 ayes and 16 noes.
And Article 1 is agreed to. The committee will now consider Article 2. Are there any amendments to Article 2?
There you have it.
Mr. Graham.
President William Jefferson Clinton is now only the third president in American history to be the subject of an article of impeachment voted by a House committee to be sent to the floor for debate. That is Article 1. It concerns alleged perjury before a federal grand jury. It is on its way now to the floor. More votes to come, of course, and there you see it. There's the draft of Article 1, and that's the language agreed to, or at least a part of it. Provided perjurious, false, and misleading testimony to independent counsel can establish federal grand jury. It goes on, but that is the core of it, the core language of Article 1, now adopted on a straight party line, 21-16 vote by the House Judiciary Committee, which has now moved on to the second article of impeachment, which deals with the alleged perjury in the Paula Jones deposition, and the debate is underway.
1998, the Judiciary Committee of the 105th Congress is embarking on the extraordinary procedure of taking a vote to report from this committee articles of impeachment of the President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton. Let history record, I, Maxine Waters, Member of Congress, representing the 35th Congressional District of the United States of America, is of sound mind, excellent health, and a clear conscience. Let history further record that I direct my remarks to my grandchildren, Cameron Titus, 10 years of age, my grandson, Mikhail, 20 years of age, to my mother, Velma Lee Moore, to my 12 brothers and sisters, living and dead, to my husband, Ambassador Sidney Williams, my dear friends and supporters, my constituents, really to all Americans and peoples of the world. I will not violate the Constitution of the United States. I will vote no on each and every vague and general article of impeachment that will be presented to this committee today. Let history record, I have fought against the impeachment of the President of the United States in every way that I know how. That my Democratic colleagues have shown in every possible way that this president has not committed perjury, obstructed justice, or committed any actions or crimes that rise to the level of impeachment. Mr. Chairman and members, let history treat me kindly as our children and children's children analyze what we do here today. Let the historians speak favorably of me because I have carefully, responsibly, and honorably exercised my duty to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America, so help me God. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, this is the article which would call for the dismissal from office of President Clinton because of false statements he made in the deposition in the Paula Jones case. I do not believe, with regard to Article 1, that false statements were demonstrated. With regard to this article, I do believe, as I read and heard the testimony, that the President spoke falsely when he denied being alone with Ms. Lewinsky. And I very much regret that. And I believe that, given the fact that the statute of limitations has not expired and won't expire for some time, he'll be subject to prosecution on that when his term expires. I do not think prosecution is likely because I believe that if someone were to bring that, it would fail. And I believe we heard from a very distinguished group of prosecutors who said...
So the debate now begins on the second article of impeachment, as Mr. Frank has just outlined, which revolves around his alleged perjury in his deposition, in the president's deposition in the Paula Jones case last January 17th. In the meantime, some Republican members are beginning to react, and Lindsey Graham, the South Carolina Republican, is having a word to say outside the room. Let's listen for a moment.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and get started. I'm Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, and I would just like to take a second to comment on the recent statement of the president. I think most of you know that for the last several weeks I've been grappling with the problem in my mind that I believe the president's conduct was criminal in nature, that it rose to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor, that it's an overwhelming case of grand jury perjury, an offense for which any president, regardless of the subject matter, should be held accountable in terms of a high crime or misdemeanor standard. Mr. Dershowitz said the same. The facts, the legal defenses presented by the president referred to in his statement, others making on his behalf, have fallen short, ring hollow, and ask you to abandon common sense. And it's a cut and paste offense that doesn't obviate the fact that the president, in August, months after the deposition in Paula Jones, where he gave false testimony, during a time when Americans of both political parties were asking him, please come clean, Mr. President, do not go into the grand jury and again perjure yourself. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, for the country, for the rule of law, I believe that's exactly what President Clinton did in August, that he went into the grand jury and he continued to provide false, misleading, and perjurious testimony. A very sad event for the country, a very unfortunate event for the rule of law and himself. I never have doubted one moment that the president has suffered from having this episode revealed, that it's been tough on him and his family. And for that, I am profoundly sorry, and I know that if we could all go back and change things about our lives, we would, and that he would most certainly try to do that. I come to you now as somebody who can understand sin, for I'm a sinner. But the president did not address what I think is essential to end this matter on a note of honor, that he did, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, violate the law while president in a serious manner, that he did things that the average citizen would be subject to going in jail for, losing their livelihood, and that he has not reconciled himself with the law. And that is unfortunate for the rule of law and the country. He mentioned people commenting on his faults, and I know that's been tough to have bad things said about you. It is not my goal or desire to ever humiliate the President, but only to end this on a note of honor by having him reconcile himself with the law. We all have faults, but the problem I have with the President is I believe he committed crimes, serious crimes. And I felt that if he would admit to those crimes in a direct, candid fashion, that somebody who comes before the law and apologizes to the law, not to your family, reconciles with the law, and America gets treated differently. It's one of the great things about this country, that if you will come before a court of law, you're treated differently. Your disposition is different because you have done a major event that the law loves. That's admit to your wrongdoing. We all love to reconcile with our family, and I hope that happens in this case. Unfortunately, the only way we will ever reconcile Bill Clinton with the law is for us to have the moral courage to find him guilty of his crimes, and I will vote to do that. These crimes rise to the level, in my opinion, of a high crime or misdemeanor, justifying a trial in the Senate, and I will regret that we could not find another way. 30, 50 years from now...
Well, there you get the sense of Lindsey Graham, who Lindsey Graham had indicated in recent days that he might be disposed to go along with something other than impeachment if the president were, as he said, to get right with the law. There you heard him say at some length that he didn't think this statement made this afternoon had accomplished that. And, of course, Graham said he would now vote for articles of impeachment. By the time he said that, of course, he'd already voted for one, as did every other of the 21 members of that Judiciary Committee, and that's therefore Article 1 has now passed on a 21-16 vote. Carl Cameron is standing by. Carl, the objections that we're beginning to hear now are to this second article. This is the one about perjury in the Paul Jones deposition. Mr. Frank spoke at some length. One sensed, as we heard what he said, that his complaint would be that it was simply not the perjury in that deposition was not proved. Correct?
And they will hearken back to arguments made by both the Democratic counsel Abby Lowell as well as the President's White House counsel as well. And many of the minority members of the committee will argue that lying under oath in the civil case, now dismissed, settled out of court, questions about materiality, both bolstered and knocked down by various experts over the course of the last 2 weeks, that this is much ado about the original nothing in the minds of the Democrats. And again, with Lindsey Graham coming out just a moment ago to say that he didn't feel as though the president's expression of contrition earlier went far enough because it didn't admit a wrongdoing, the vote was cast at 4:25, and moments before the actual vote was cast on the articles of impeachment, the president was in the Rose Garden issuing that apology. And in fact, Lindsey Graham, as the votes were originally being cast, was talking to a reporter in the hallway and had to run back into the committee room. So he had an opportunity to see some of the president's speech. But
yeah, that's right. That's right, Carl. He voted last. All right, Carl, thanks very much. Congressman Sensenbrenner, the ranking, that is to say the senior next to the chairman, Republican on the committee, is speaking to this second article of impeachment. Let's listen to a bit of Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Was to prevent her from doing that. That is a very, very serious result of that perjury. And it all goes to the business of whether an employee of the state of Arkansas who claimed that the governor of Arkansas sexually harassed her, denied her civil rights. The Supreme Court said she had a right to proceed in gathering evidence, and where I believe the president obstructed her wrongfully and perjuriously was to prevent her from obtaining that evidence. Now, the law on perjury does not depend upon the outcome of the case. The case was thrown out of court by Judge Wright. It was appealed, and the president paid a significant judgment before the appeal was decided. The issue of alleged perjury is whether it was material at the time the alleged perjurious statement was made. And here we have a decision of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia that was placed under seal and was unsealed just recently that said it was material, the false statements, and those material false statements were directly designed to change the outcome of the case. That related to the affidavit of Monica Lewinsky that even the president's lawyer had to send a letter to the court instructing him to disregard. Now, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Michigan.
Before I begin, I'm going to briefly recognize Mr.
Thank
Frank.
you, Ranking Member. The gentleman from Wisconsin completely misstated my position. I was not suggesting that the activity involving Paula Jones was in any way consensual. Yes, sexual harassment is wrong, but for the gentleman to suggest that I'm allowing sexual harassment when I say consensual sex, misunderstands sexual harassment. The terrible thing about harassment is precisely that it is non-consensual, that it overcomes the victim's no with other threats. My point was that the Monica Lewinsky-Bill Clinton relationship was, according to Monica Lewinsky, in an uncontested way, wholly consensual. There was not a shred of any evidence of sexual harassment between Monica Lewinsky. And when I say I want a war, I believe that the wholly consensual relationship between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky was in fact irrelevant to the accusation of harassment by Paula Jones. And I think we do a disservice to sexual harassment law by letting that distinction be eroded.
I thank my colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, this second article deals with perjury in the Jones deposition, and the Republicans on this committee would impeach the President of the United States over a tortured definition of the phrase sexual relations. Now, we all saw the deposition videotape of the 15-minute conversation among the three lawyers and a judge about what the definition of sexual relations in that case meant. We witnessed, watched, and listened to it. No one in the deposition room, aside from the Paula Jones lawyers, who were in effect setting up the president, understood what that definition meant. The judge in the case even said that after all she heard, that she did not think that the president understood the definition. This is on the record. The president's testimony about his consensual relationship with Ms. Lewinsky was not material to the Paula Jones claim that the president made unwanted advances toward her. Could that still be in dispute? Judge Weber Wright made that clear in 3 separate rulings, that testimony about the president's relationships with other women simply did not go to the core of the issues put in dispute by Ms. Jones. The Republicans misstate that the issue of materiality was settled by the litigation involving Ms. Lewinsky's lawyer, Frank Carter. The only thing that the litigation involving Mr. Carter decided is that Ms. Lewinsky's affidavit was material to the limited question in that case. That is, whether Ms. Lewinsky's affidavit was material to whether she should have to testify as a deposition witness in the Jones case. The court, considering that limited issue, never considered the overall materiality of the Lewinsky testimony to the Jones case, and would and could not have made a ruling on a case pending on in another court.
As Democratic Congressman John Conyers, the senior Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, continues to read the statement that he prepared in opposition to this second article of impeachment, it's worth reviewing a little bit about what this debate is about. The second article of impeachment concerns the president's testimony in the Paula Jones case, in which he said, among other things, these 2 things. One is that he was there is the article that he's saying that he provided perjurious, false, and misleading testimony in a federal civil rights action brought against him by Paula Corbin Jones. Now, in that deposition, he said a number of things about his relationship with Paula Jones. He didn't have sexual relations with her. He didn't have a sexual affair with her. He said, and he also said this. He said that he did not recall being alone with her, and he said later in the deposition, when his lawyer had in hand Monica Lewinsky's affidavit, and we're talking here about being alone with Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky had given an affidavit saying that she had had no sex of any kind with the president. Now, that affidavit, as we all now know, was false. Bill Bennett, the president's lawyer, was urging the judge to curb the questioning of the president on that subject and citing the affidavit as reason to do so. And in the course of so doing, he said he went through, reviewed with the judge, summarized for the judge the affidavit's blanket denial of any kind of sexual relations with the president on the part of Ms. Lewinsky. The president, the videotape showed yesterday, was at that time apparently listening, and because he was nodding. Mr. Bennett then turned to the president and said, "Isn't that true?" meaning the Lewinsky affidavit. The president said, "Yes, that's absolutely true." Of course, the Republicans have contended that the events have showed that it was indeed absolutely false. So the question arises of whether the statement and the whole issue was, quote, material, that is to say, relevant to the matter before the court, which was the Jones case. And this is one of these things that has been argued flat and argued round by nearly everybody. Now, all of this ensues, and the Democrats are going to argue this materiality thing for some time, one suspects. Now, in the meantime, of course, we have had the vote on the first article of impeachment. It has passed 21-16. It came only minutes after the president concluded his statement in the Rose Garden, gotten up on fairly short notice down at the White House. Our White House correspondent, Jim Angle, is standing by. And Jim, bring us up to date on what we now know about the statement and the reaction to the first article of impeachment passing.
With spokesman Joe Lockhart saying the fact that the vote was along party lines speaks for itself. Of course, the president having taken a much more conciliatory, even apologetic tone today, some members of the White House staff can now go back to a little harsher tone that they had employed until the last few days when they started to worry about how to appeal to moderate Republicans who might be willing to go the president's way on an impeachment vote. Clearly, those who were struggling with the impeachment vote and those who were arguing for censure needed something from the president to hang their hats on. That's what he gave them today in a speech in the Rose Garden in which he said he was profoundly sorry for what he's done wrong in words and deeds, and also that accountability demands consequences. And in an attempt to encourage the efforts toward censure and away from impeachment, the president made clear he is willing to take whatever Congress dishes out. Here's what he said.
What I want the American people to know, what I want the Congress to know, is that I am profoundly sorry for all I have done wrong in words and deeds. I never should have misled the country, the Congress, my friends, or my family. Quite simply, I gave in to my shame. I have been condemned by my accusers with harsh words. And while it's hard to hear yourself called deceitful and manipulative, I remember Ben Franklin's admonition that our critics are our friends, for they do show us our faults. Mere words cannot fully express the profound remorse I feel for what our country is going through and for what members of both parties in Congress are now forced to deal with. So nothing, not piety, nor tears, nor wit, nor torment, can alter what I have done. I must make my peace with that. I must also be at peace with the fact that the public consequences of my actions are in the hands of the American people and their representatives in the Congress. Should they determine that my errors of word and deed require their rebuke and censure, I am ready to accept that.
Now, Britt, the president leaves for the Middle East early tomorrow morning. This was his last chance to make a statement for the next 4 days, at least from the United States, one that would have the impact of standing in the Rose Garden, and also at a time when it still had a chance to get on the evening news, obviously wanting to make as big an impact across the country and to members of Congress who may be in their districts, as big an impact as he possibly can. This was obviously an attempt by the White House here at the last moment to put some sort of imprint on this process to change the momentum which the White House had clearly judged was going against the president, and that is why he spoke. Brett?
Jim, help me out with one thing if you can, and it may be as hard for you as it has been for me. the president said, "I gave in to my shame." What does that mean?
I have not been able to figure that one out, Britt. It sounds more like he gave in to his weaknesses, but it is hard to tell. As you know, the president is famous for using somewhat difficult language from time to time, language that is somewhat difficult to penetrate. Even some of the things that we do know what they meant were somewhat difficult. I cannot figure that one out. The other things were more clear, and as we were saying earlier, I think the president came about as close as he is likely to come to saying that he lied outright and saying that he was sorry for what he has done wrong in words and deeds.
And he also, yeah, but the strongest word he used was misled.
Right, right. And he used the word misled. That is something, of course, they have used quite often. The president hasn't said, quite to the extent he did today, that he's profoundly sorry, except in the prayer breakfast. There was that one moment. Now, you remember during this whole process that the president had to be dragged kicking and screaming to make some sort of statement of contrition. The moment that what forced him to do so, back when he was talking at the prayer breakfast and other moments, was a speech on the Senate floor by Senator Lieberman, a Democrat who is fairly close to Mr. Clinton, who gave a very stirring speech about what the president had done and the need for him to somehow say that what he had done was wrong, and created really a crisis of